still no land in sight as Cecilia stood at the foredeck. Around her the crewless ship held its course as gusts of winds began to buffet the sails, making them billow in and out rhythmically. Storm clouds were gathering on the horizon. She turned, facing the direction of the breezes and letting them blow coolly on her face. Despite the drop in air pressure, the air was still warm. The day, her second aboard a ship, was drawing to its twilight. Before long Cecilia would be alone in the North Sea with the blackness closing around her. The ship, with a pre-prepared cabin below and self-appearing food in the mess, knew her destination, and she knew they had been sailing southwest because of the rougher proximity of the ship to the sun's path in the sky. Eventually she would be back in Britain, the smooth transit of the ship behind her, the eerie ghostliness of the solitude gone. She would be with Septimus and, heaven help her, the rest of them. Even now it was hard to see these people as friends, or even colleagues. That she had lived and worked with them, wizards and none, for so long, presuming she knew them and, because of so many misjudgments, offered herself up for humiliation. So many things hadn't happened here, or had but with slight differences. Aberforth had counselled her many times over her situation, and though he had been sympathetic and empathetic, he hadn't truly understood. And even though Cleus said the right things, it was always with such smoothness and professionalism that even she knew he was just giving her soothing-sounding words. Why had she jumped in so readily? Looking back, it hardly made sense. But the reality was that here was so like where she had come from. She had convinced herself that it actually was. Because of her. Because of her changing the memory clouds behind the veil when she had passed through it. Here Joseph Black was the founder of the Reciprocators, an organization associated with the ministry which openly promoted wizard and non-wizard collaboration. Raymond Lully, an outcast of Sirius Black's family in the old world, a reciprocator who had collaborated with Poppy Pomfrey's grandfather Pompops, connected to the traitor Oswald Avery, who had given Remus's father the task of looking after mysterious mythology, the original book whose illustrations and diagrams had aided Cecilia in uncovering the universal link were merely a footnote in the history of collaboration here, being the wizard who had tried to stop the attack on the wizard bank Gringotts in 1956. Instead, Avery here had been behind the attack by a werewolf on the Lupin cottage with the aim of scaring off their father in joining the Reciprocator movement. The beginning, if we're needing to be pinpointed, of the Conjurists. Cecilia was the very last secret collaborator, recruited by Albus Dumbledore, the very last reciprocator in the old world. How far she had come since those dim first days, in the old place, when she had thrown together some ideas written hastily on scraps of paper about what she thought wizards should know about non-wizards. How she had stabbed in the dark regarding genetics, treading ineptly on the feelings of those people she was there to help. How she had arrogantly lesson planned, and a collection of these random things a scheme of work. What else could she have done? What would anyone have done in her situation? She looked overboard at the indigo dark North Sea below her. Although they were skimming the waves quickly, the progress was slow, and Cecilia believed that when she had slept in the hammock within the cabin, the only cabin that opened when it had become dark the night before, the ship hastened only by her conscious thoughts somehow? Or at least, that was what one of her colleagues with whom she had worked, or, more accurately, spied on, at Durmstrang had described it. Was it too much for her to hope that the ship would sail to the west coast of Cumbria or the Solway Firth, so she had only a few miles to cover to the Lupin cottage? And to see her son, oh! How she missed him. Her darling son who gave her so much joy. Who was her reason for not complaining, for being treated so ill by his uncle. And Cleus knew he had exploited her too. She leaned over the railing and watched the miniature waves lapping by the hull and thought about the last decade or so. She was now in her 40s and had seen so much, so many fantastical, wonderful, dangerous things. So many time-stealing things. The time had gone in a flash, and what had she, other than her son, to show for it? Cecilia thought about the time she had received the letter of 15th of July 1996, coaxing her curiosity into action. How simple life was before she had received it. What if she never had? Had it not been for the vain, selfish streak in her personality, and she might never have left Edgewood, pining as she had been for her dead husband, and possibly still in search of a purpose. A selfish side which might have left her in Edgewood. She would almost certainly not have been here, having crossed the dimensions of space, time to a different reality governed by altered past events, where she had made commitments to people, her own son the most significant of which, that she was finding it difficult, almost impossible to honor. Who knows what the world would be like if it hadn't been for her? It might have been better, for her, on balance. A crunch behind her brought Cecilia into the here and now. Searching the wooden deck for what sounded like damage, she scanned the deck as she hunted for its origin. The last thing she wanted was to be lost in the middle of the North Sea. But it was only the tiller, crunching around as it drove the capstan and shifting their position in the water. Cecilia ran her fingers through her hair and lay down on the middeck, her eyes at one with the now star-revealing sky. How would it have been never to have known about wizards and magic? Never to have racked her mind over the puzzle of old magic that had been wrapped up in the enigma of mysterious mythology. That she had been just another person, shaking her head in shocked dismay at the apparent sporadic massacre of almost 100 moles that had occurred 3 months after the letter, at Halloween. Oh yes, she knew about it, no matter how hard someone in the Order of the Phoenix had tried to conceal it from her. But, as the connections between magic and science had increasingly knitted together in this world through the very nature of their commonalities, Cecilia Frobisher from the old world would have been astounded at the many outcomes of scientific and magical research. For example, the killings had not been random but systematic, carried out by the Death Eaters by establishing a genetic link between people, a gene in common, for example, from just one sample of hair or blood. The basis of old magic as explained by science. The Death Eaters had been able to incapacitate people with one particular chromosome in common and leave them isolated so they could be finished off at the Dark Wizard's leisure. Very powerful indeed, and awe-inspiring, especially if you didn't know how it worked. Marvelous, however, if you did, but no less disturbing. It was no wonder old magic was so revered, both in the old world and this one, for it tapped into the very fundamentals of science and produced eye-opening effects. It had been Remus who had told her about the deaths, a few weeks after she had moved back into his cottage. But, Cecilia had further discovered, the massacre on the 31st October, just after she had arrived back from analyzing the DNA samples at her old lab in Edgewood with Nick Smith, had been her Coventry. It was disgusting. It had reviled her to know that Dumbledore had put so much trust and invested so much in her and her work that he had made the Order stand by and allow the deaths to happen, sacrificing the lives on moles on the gamble that she would succeed with the potion for Harry so that he could defeat Lord Voldemort. Once she did know, the knowledge of this had driven her on, her dogged determination that she shouldn't stop, even though every fiber had been telling her for months that she should. It had got worse with the exhaustion she was feeling at the Dursleys' house, but of course that had been pregnancy, possibly. Well, according to Petunia Dursley in any case, but she was doubtful of a lot of things that had happened before she had disappeared behind the veil and traversed the memories. What had driven her on when she felt so removed from Harry's potion in the old world, she knew, had been the other of her twin purposes, which was something entirely personal. A cure for Remus based around the presence of silver nitrate in whatever elixir she might have been able to design. It was the substance that had the possibility of destroying the lycanthropy parasite which caused the werewolf, always a wizard, to change when the water within the body's cells was polarized because of the full moon. It was one thing she wished she could have discovered herself, a personal link to her Remus, back in the old world, put to death for his being a so-called half-breed. Here it was entirely unnecessary, for it was clear who was the werewolf, not Remus, and his condition had been under control since Severus Snape had developed a cure for him from ultra-rare ingredients when he was in his second year at Hedgewood's. Her mind wandered as she retrod old thoughts. Could he make it again? Could she? Why was Cecilia even using her mind to think of this utterly irrelevant question when she had promised herself she was going to put science and magic, and all that had come from the universal link behind her? Once she had decided this, once she had decided to commit herself to her family no matter what, and forget her academic pursuits, crystallized at the moment Remus had made his way to Durmstrang and they had vowed passionately that they would put one another first, Cecilia had a purpose. But she didn't suppose it was going to be easy. Those long-lost days in the past and a different time were part of her, things which wouldn't be so easily to disregard, in the same way as the differences in this world were hard to ignore. At first it had amused Cecilia to spot differences between the two worlds, ranging from hundreds of subtle nuances to the one huge discrepancy, namely wizards being known in the world by non-wizards. She would find herself chuckling inwardly to herself as she compared the two. Perhaps this was one reason she found it so hard to put the past behind her. Maybe it had been herself after all who had sown the seeds of discord between her and the reciprocators. Cecilia inhaled the warm, now night air as the main-tops of the sails scored the night sky above her, as if connecting the stars like a celestial dot to dot. Shivering, she sat up and reached for her coat before lying back down in the uneven deck. Not that there were many differences, nothing you could really point to, but enough to be noticeable. Differences in sports, for example, was one thing she noticed: match scores, lineups, team names. Sheffield Thursday? Who would have credited it? The existence of Quidditch as a wizard game held in equivalent esteem to the mighty football. Slight shifts in dates of reigning British monarchs were another difference, along with several more wives for Henry VIII, a rearrangement of the sequence of Plantagenet kings, but with no difference in outcome, and William IV being known as the Air Force King. Flight had been developed over a century earlier here, and this monarch had chosen a different armed force in which to serve. Subtle changes in the flight path of Lepidoptera, with little overall consequence, rather a change in the history books. But there were other areas where the butterfly of chaos may have given a huge flap in the other direction. Whereas in the old world, the other places she liked to call the past dimension, Minerva McGonagall merely came from Dundee and supposed she was related to that most dreadful of poets, William. Here Minerva Topaz McGonagall had produced brilliant acclaimed poetry which was admired by both wizards and non-wizards alike. Freya, whom of course, she knew she would take in when she found out she was an orphan and whose parents had suffered at the hands of conjurists when Cecilia had first arrived. The little 7-year-old in this world had a gold bracelet with a date of birth on, given to her by her grandmother, the date of birth being that of Freya's grandmother. It was identical to the one which, in the old place, Cecilia had left with her friend Libby for Freya's birthday when she had left to work with the order, which had belonged to Cecilia's grandmother. And so that little butterfly, its fleeting vector having been altered by Cecilia herself, had progressed from amusing to irritating to downright annoying. She had been the direct cause of the unit of power now being called the Black, rather than a what, for it had been Joseph Black who had collaborated openly with non-wizards and developed the steam engine rather than Matthew Bolton's partner. Which of course had resulted in mutual wizard-non-wizard collaboration, sowed the seeds of resentment in both a number of non-wizards but, more significantly, wizards, and had resulted in the existence of the narrow-minded, ignorant conjurists. Cecilia's thoughts drifted to the near future. What would it be like when she got back to Britain? At least at Durmstrang, with highly academic but socially isolated wizards, she had a kind of connection. She could talk about scientific and magical theories and not be considered a threat or be made to feel different. In a strange way, in the extremes of right-wing wizardry as existed here, whose ever-emerging theories about the differences between wizards and non-wizards were constant fodder to whoever was driving the conjurists. She fitted in. But she had no one at home, not even Remus, who had tried his best to understand. She knew. Aberforth Dumbledore had been the only one who she could ever confide, but in his successors, Callias and Severus, no such empathy. Cecilia had long ago stopped hoping for an equivalent tear or two once she had embarrassed herself with Severus and Callias had made her leave after the spectacle that was Aberforth's wake. The stars twinkled brighter now as night set in. Cecilia loved the night, the all-enveloping darkness, where distinctions between gender, appearance, magical ability, all of those things which people discriminated against other people existed. For so long Cecilia sought the dark, hiding herself away from her family when she first went to work with Albus Dumbledore, from the students at Hedgewoods, from the Ministry who were hunting her and Remus after the great battle, from the Dursleys. Who wouldn't love darkness when it afforded so much protection and anonymity? And then there were things which never happened here at all. From the point of view of the reciprocators, Cecilia had just appeared out of nowhere. Only a handful of people, Remus and Callias, the ministers who had been there when Cecilia had been rescued, Lucius Malfoy, Rodolphus Lestrange, Mick, and Dave Mullen, and Aberforth, who had explained to her the evidence of her journey, the letter of 15th July, which he described as an intransmutable object. No matter what else had changed in this reality compared to where she had come from, this stayed the same. And, to complete the comparisons which her mind was clearly so keen to make, Cecilia considered the wizard who had orchestrated the infiltration of the reciprocators in the old place, not so nearly well developed because of their secretive nature. Here, Oswald T. Avery was credited as the wizard who began first linked Pensieves together rather than the metaphorical axe-wielder severing as many links between wizard and mole reciprocators as he could find. In the 1930s here, in order to save on legwork between university and academic research facilities, Avery developed a way in which Pensieves could be connected together to send flu messages and scrolls instantly and more than one person. What wizard was without the interpensieve, or the wizard wide web? In short, her meddling in the thoughts and memories of wizards had resulted in many alterations to the present, not least the included the change in the course of the reciprocators' fate which had resulted in Joseph Black becoming the founder of the reciprocator movement rather than its assassin. People had met, not met people, married, died, were born, were educated, lived differently as a result. Some people had not even existed, Raymond Lully being one, and with him no Goblin riots in 1956, no need to pass on the universal link hidden so skillfully in a copy of mysterious mythology, for that deception was never needed. Oh, how much would she have loved to have that book back, Remus's family's copy, the one with the words energy light magic running around the page borders. She could see it still, in front of her still, in her mind's eye. It reminded her so much of the Remus she loved, reminded her of Remus here, who was her beloved in name only, so different that he was in many ways to her werewolf, and how she had to keep going for Septimus, how she was returning now for the love of her child and the pragmatic commitment she had made to the wizard she had married. What else had she been expecting though, with so many differences in history? She could hardly have expected those wizards she had worked so closely with in the old place to be the same. Clearly the reciprocators bore some resemblance to the Order of the Phoenix, and to some extent they were now fighting a similar prejudice in conjurers that the Order fought in Voldemort. But for some their roles were dramatically altered, not least because of the fact that Lily and James Potter lived here, but also Henrietta Edwards, killed in the old place by Regulus Black to prove his loyalty to Voldemort. But more than that. For example, it had been Aberforth Dumbledore who was the head of the Reciprocators, rather than Albus, who she had been expecting. He kept secrets, but on behalf of peacekeeping and research and development, home security one might say. Gellert Grindelwald was the major influence in the life of the elder Dumbledore brother, and, had Grindelwald never met Albus, the Dumbledore family might well have been a happier one. To what extent Cecilia had not been sure, but those were Aberforth's words one evening when she had, for yet another time, poured out her insecurities, fears and worries to the ever-patient wizard. In fact, Cecilia thought they were probably the last words of significance Aberforth had ever spoken to her. Whatever the statement meant, Albus may well have been the leader of the order rather than some dangerous fundamentalist raising and nurturing bigoted fears and misappropriations in wizards. The leader of the reciprocators, Cecilia corrected herself aloud, as the ship creaked around her, tacking into the wind. For here, she mused as the groundswell of water enlivened the ship's passage, Tom Riddle's father and mother had defied his grandfather and got married, lived together in quiet ordinary circumstances and sent all 17 of their sons to Hedgewoods rather than their eldest son becoming the most feared dark wizard ever known. Cecilia shook her head, the gesture seen by no one, of course. Would she ever be able to get over the dual comparisons? Would she never just be able to just live her life? She had been so caught up in the science of magic here, in this place, which she had forgotten to stop. Or had been afraid to, knowing that it had given her a purpose before. In Old World she was at the beginning, a pioneer. Here, what she thought was marvelous and novel was pedestrian, infantile almost. No wonder the reciprocators had humored her, but never really taken her seriously. How long had she known that, deep down? It was as if she had been overawed at her own ability to have discovered fire or invented the wheel. Not only was fire harnessed, but millions of different permutations of the wheel were in operation. These things took their place in the background of people's everyday lives, as did the universal link, leaving her adrift, trying to blend together the developments that had happened here with where she had been before she had come through the veil. Trying to educate herself, filling in as many gaps as she could. It was hardly worth commenting on here. Perhaps this had been Cecilia's problem. Laboring under the impression that her efforts were worthy of note. What had she been here, other than a spare part, a hanger-on? What was her purpose, actually? She had been originally employed by Albus Dumbledore to find a way of defeating the overarching evil that existed, Lord Voldemort, but here, Albus Dumbledore was the overarching evil. In a fashion she had been allowed a small role in helping on the espionage side of things, and when she had attempted theoretical integration between magic and science she had been knocked down, continually and consistently, embarrassing both herself and Remus, turning the reciprocators against her and generally causing her own isolation. Perhaps too because she had assumed that the reciprocators were just the same people as they had been, or expected them to be in the case of those who were now alive and had not made a distinction. Sirius, though unburdened with the deaths of his friends and the blame lying with him, was still the same jokey, have a laugh, take nothing seriously wizard she had known, who had spied on her, flirted with her and had her help him right at the end. Before, he had broken into her house to take back mysterious mythology, or at least try to, and the same wizard, playing by his own rules, existed here. A measure of bravado, of front, still remained. But his attitude to Cecilia was entirely indifferent, blocking her efforts at every turn, for he believed, and regularly openly said, that she didn't belong. Callias had taken many knocks for her, but, of course, he knew the truth of her being there. Didn't he? Indifference then gave way to him utterly despising her after the showdown at Aberforth's wake. For that case, she had been glad she had been sent to Durmstrang. Then there was that piece of work, Henrietta Edwards, a former friend, helping her by providing her information about what she knew about science just so as to trip her up, eventually, and embarrass her, when the time was right for her own professional advancement, befriending her only to let her fall and make her a fool. How was it that it took a moonless magical ship voyage for that to become so clear? And the beauty of the witch's cunning was that she had done it to her so many times without Cecilia's knowledge. Looking back, it was easy to see how the woman, encouraging her in her research that she had done, knowing how unpopular it was with the rest of the reciprocators, and when she had challenged her at Aberforth's wake, Henrietta had simply stood by wordlessly, as if she had agreed with the rest of the witches and wizards all along. Slippery, devious, scheming, conniving, treacherous. A born politician. The only difference between Henrietta Edwards and Cleis Lupin was that the woman was merely interested in only herself, interested only in people if it meant she ascended the status ladder in life, thinking nothing at all of the people she had used to get from rung to rung. At least Cleis's intentions came from dog duty, however much she disagreed with them. Oh, there were times when she had been genuine enough, but turn on the fakeness button and she was manipulation witchified. For a long time Cecilia had considered her a friend, she had socialized with her, confided in her. It had been Petunia Black who had come to be a strong ally and a genuine friend who had actually listened to Cecilia after the incident at Grimmauld Place with the reciprocators, Henrietta and Freya. She always had, there when she had cause to offload when work was getting on top of her, laugh about the funny things Septimus did or said as he was growing up, shared a laugh and a joke, talked about Dudley and Darren Dursley, the schools they were going to, Dudley's increasingly outrageous haircuts and fashions, hardly appropriate for a Ministry of Magic accountant, so thought his mother. A genuine friend. Someone who, though closely connected to the reciprocators through Regulus, although neither were reciprocators themselves, listened with genuine alarm and offered her sympathy when she related the whole sorry affair. Petunia had made Cecilia feel much better about herself, making her realize that she was not being mean-spirited when she felt resentment towards Henrietta for her treatment of her, and that it showed more about Henrietta Edwards's character than it did about Cecilia's. "I know," Petunia had said, making Cecilia a cup of black tea, topping up on several other teas Petunia had made for her the evening after the afternoon of horror. "I used to think she was all right too. But, you know Cissy, she was so boring." Cecilia had giggled, in the way she had done with friends long gone. "When I had heard Cleis had proposed her as a reciprocator I wondered how, I'm being serious, she's so dense." Petunia then walked across her own living room doing a perfect impression of Henrietta's strut. "She went to Hedgewood's with us, she was in my house. She would want to walk to lessons with me." Petunia had sipped her tea. "You know, I ended up making excuses not to go with her, and, you know, I chose to be late lots of times rather have to wait for her and walk with her to lessons." Seems like she spent her time learning how to be manipulative, Cecilia had mused aloud, working out how to play people to get her to where she needed to be. Petunia had nodded a little and had clapped Cecilia her on the back. "She's really got under your skin, hasn't she? Look, there's no love lost between us," she had added when the cloud of shame had wiped itself all over Cecilia's face. "If you need a vent, you're more than welcome, anytime, mate. We all need to rant from time to time. I don't know how my sister stands her, but Lily was always much more kind-hearted and patient than me." Another time, in the months just before Aberforth's death, and when she was beginning to suspect that Henrietta was not all she seemed, at her last visit to Grimmauld Place in a fruitless search for Severus Snape, Henrietta had commented about her own freedom to do what she wanted without responsibilities, saying she was ever grateful for not needing so desperately to be defined by a man. Nothing directly attacking Cecilia of course, but that was how Henrietta Edwards operated. She had had nearly 2 years to contemplate that. Lily had said she had been married for a long time and Henrietta had replied that that was different, she was a reciprocator in her own right. A broadside to Cecilia. Everyone knew that she was the outsider, none more so than Cecilia herself. She had brought this up with Petunia months later. "Do you know what I call her, when I realize she's being like this?" Petunia had smiled, after soothing her with tea and cake. "I call her a conjurist." Cecilia had darted her a knife-sharp look. She's not being anti-non-wizard, Petunia had justified, sipping her own tea. She's being anti-people who stand in her way. She sees you as a threat, Cecilia. A threat? Cecilia had been genuinely shocked. But I'm not. How do I threaten her? By being a non-wizard, and doing the work that she was not chosen for, Petunia had confided, lowering her voice and smiling, knowing she was sharing a not-too-well-kept secret. She has no brains for what you do. She couldn't do the research you've done. She wonders what you're going to do in the future that will threaten her, and she's taking steps to knock you down. She's a bully, Cecilia, always has been. She's doing what women do when they feel threatened. It's non-traceable, like gossip, and oh, hasn't she had all her life to perfect the art of manipulation and intrigue? The wizards probably don't even realize what's going on, and the witches? Well, if they do notice, then they're just putting up with her, and if they don't, it's because she's being Henrietta. Mrs. Voldemort, more like. Cecilia had uttered, dully. Petunia had laughed. Yes, like that terrible wizard in your book, Henrietta. What will Mrs. V do next, I wonder? Mrs. V, and that's what Cecilia had called her, in her mind, when Henrietta had been her scheming, conniving self. Now, as she looked out into the darkness, she pictured the woman's beautiful, striking features twisted with years of cunning and deviousness, shaking her head. You can't hurt me, Mrs. V. You want information? Well, you're not having it. What I have here belongs to Callias. He deserves it, after all. I don't work with the reciprocators anymore. I won't again. Stick that up your wand and make a spell from it. She wished she had managed to get a message back to Petunia while she had been at Durmstrang, telling her how much she had bolstered Cecilia when she had been at her lowest. In some respects she should probably have taken a step back years ago, when the work had come to its natural end. Perhaps if she had had something of her own in this world she might have felt more secure, but even what she had produced, the story that never was, hadn't been entirely independent of it all. In a lot of ways she had a lot to thank Cleus for. Being away from the reciprocators and into an academic research environment, though a magical one, had probably saved Cecilia from cracking up. If only she had insisted Septimus had come with her, she could have educated him at Durmstrang, despite its extreme view on wizards and non-wizards. But the overriding factor which had stayed her in insisting was that Septimus would have been away from all he knew, those things which, at 8, he needed more than her: a stable school life, social structure, his friends. Remus had agreed that this should happen, probably the most civil conversation they had had since the incident after Aberforth's funeral. It had been a very civil parting after nearly 10 years of marriage. Remus had kissed her stiffly on the cheek before Cleus had flew her to the Brocken, in the Harz Mountains. From there, the entrance to Durmstrang via the Rostrap, at the top of the cliff. It was a port key, but you stepped out over the edge of the cliff before putting your foot not in midair and then tumbling to your death but onto a dark basalt floor in the foundations of the school itself. Considering the institute was at the top of an island mountain, it was the highest up basement Cecilia knew, and, when Cleus described the dim, dank area as the welcome room, she had wondered how Spartan and chilling the rest of the place must be. She had very few things to give to the welcome elf who had come to meet them. Merely her private, personal belongings and things which meant she could carry out her everyday work for which she had been humiliatingly sent away. She got to her feet, trying to calm her emotions. Looking ahead, Cecilia focused on the thinnest line of orange on the horizon, the wind on her face. Now Cecilia wondered whether it had been the sharpness of the air on her face which had caused tears to spring to her eyes as the smooth passage of the ship headed in the direction of the light. She suspected not. Though there was no one around, she didn't want to express her ever-growing feelings of inadequacies and ill-treatment that had preceded her stay at Durmstrang, and she stared harder at the meager light source. Even now she wondered how she could have borne the shame-inducing situation of her role. And she had accepted it, ovine-like, allowing herself to be treated that way, as if she were the only person at fault. That the blame lay with her and her alone. She had had a long time to think since then, and her departure now was her belated response to her incarceration. But she couldn't say that she hadn't gained something from being around such highly focused wizards. Perfecting her own investigations, she had verbalized and crystallized her own thoughts, musings and hypotheses given unlimited time. The universal link, connecting both science and magic, had been reduced to a hobby of an unpopular non-wizard woman back in Britain by the reciprocators, but she had never been dismissed, even by wizards with such extreme views, or at least, her inner scientist corrected, producing evidence which supported the cause of extreme views. Science can never be context-free, and it usually depends on the people funding the research as to the questions which are asked, so the most advantageous results can be obtained. Those using the results can then say that they were backed by evidence from scientific research, giving them more credit. But you can hardly blame the researchers themselves, especially as most of the research teachers at Durmstrang made Tabitha Penright look positively normal in her approach to things. If she had one overarching regret, however, it was that she hadn't spent enough time talking to Tabitha. She seemed the most honest of their lot, speaking her mind freely and judging no one. That was what the Durmstrangers had been like, wholly accepting her in terms of academic pursuit, no question of emotion or personal manipulation. Nothing was ever personal with them, nor Tabitha. It was no surprise that she had ended it with Severus, though. When you saw someone once every 6 months, you could hardly call that a relationship. The orange line was now getting wider, and, in the foreground, Cecilia thought she could see another patch of orange in the foreground. Sodium orange light pollution? Perhaps they were nearing land. The ship seemed to know where it was going. From the position of the sun, which she had tracked the previous day, they seemed to be heading in the direction of the UK. Her heart quickened. Britain. Where, when the ministry caught up with her, she would have a lot of explaining to do. But if her plan came to pass, then she, Septimus and Remus could live in peace, away from it all. Her mind drifted back to Tabitha again, but then focused sharply on Snape. Even he, who had seemed so genuine, had, she could see, looking back, been humoring her from the start. He had made no contact with her in the nearly 2 years she had been away, despite frequent missives on her part. Clearly he had grown tired of her doggedness. Or had been utterly disgusted at her behavior at the wake. Or been repulsed by her embarrassing show of emotions when last they had met. Cecilia shook her head, trying to shake away their memories of it all as if they were an etch-a-sketch picture. She fixed again her gaze on the horizon, scanning it for further evidence of their location. It did her no good either to dwell on the past, nor the past in the old place either, a comfort though it might be when she caught herself still half think of herself as Mrs. Frobisher, the widow of Tim Frobisher, who she had been pathetic enough to research and discover, emigrated from Edgewood to Canada 20 years ago and was now a skiing instructor in the Canadian Rockies. The widow of Remus Lupin, put to death for his disability. The employee of Albus Dumbledore in a place where Voldemort terrorized both Mole and Wizard, where she had been of some use. Well, now was the time that she would forget the other dimension where she had come from, and the bad times in the last decade in this one too. She knew this was the time Cecilia had already begun on the path which led away from scientific and magical research and onto her life with her family. She had burned her research notes, she had made peace with her husband. She had defied the ministry by leaving Durmstrang, so as to live here rather than exist. Her heart glowed. She could be mum to Septimus again. He was alive here, her beloved son, an 11-year-old who needed his mother. Whatever had possessed her to leave him? How could she ever have? She forced a block down in her mind. No. No regrets. No grudges or bitterness. The past had often been described as a foreign country by wordsmiths far more skilled and poetic than she. And, Like her exodus from the tiny Niagan ship of land just east of the mainland in the Norwegian North Atlantic, it was also difficult to leave. She looked about her again as the proto-light of dawn filtered into vision. Land loomed ahead, the streetlights glowing brighter and welcoming. Cecilia smiled and thought of her son again. Forget the guilt of being absent for 2 years. She would be there for him for the rest of her life now, once she set foot on the land ahead of her. And she could support, guide, love, respect Remus too, be his wife properly. Her heart rose as she thought about that night in June. He had arrived up unexpectedly to see her at Durmstrang, borne his inner fears and aspirations for their marriage as she had hers. He had agreed to put aside all that had happened with the reciprocators and defend her, as his wife, as he had done already in her absence. Cecilia had promised to abandon all research work concerning science and magic, forget and never mention the other place and do something else when she eventually got back to Britain alongside being full-time mum at home to Septimus. And then they had sworn to love one another for the rest of their lives, breathing the freshness of life back into their corpse of a marriage which had, until that night, been clinging to mere threads of vitality. Cecilia hoped that Remus would not be too shocked or annoyed at seeing her back sooner than he expected. She could not be happier. To say it had been life-changing was not overstating the fact. They had made up when Cecilia thought that their marriage was over bar the paperwork. And when he had touched her hand it was as if she had been transported back to Sirius's spare room in the other Grimmauld place, at Christmas, when he had attacked her. The spark of familiarity but the newness too. That night, that glorious June night, they had been together, made love, as she had always hoped they would, even better than at the start of their relationship here, in this world. Two people but with one heart, one mind, one soul, one purpose. No. Cecilia shook her head again as unmistakably the grey line of land showed up on the horizon. No more for her science and magic for her, no more otherworld, with its Death Eaters, Voldemort, Albus Dumbledore, near-broken Snape and wretched Harry. Goodbye universal link and endless, thankless research. No more teaching. No more Hogwarts. Or Hedgewoods either for that matter. She had chosen happy overright and that was something she needed to keep reminding herself about whenever the drug of academia began to torment her soul. Hello future, I'll take you. Whatever you hold for Mrs. Lupin. Soothing though these thoughts were, it was what she was going to do practically when she got back to Cleus's cottage in the Lake District that needed to occupy her thoughts, Cecilia knew. The land loomed nearer and she put the inconvenient thought to one side as she tried to work out where she was and, more importantly, what would happen when the ship reached it. Overhead the sails flapped as the land grew closer. The ship slowed, bereft of the best of the breeze. It would take some time to reach the coast. She sat back down cross-legged on the deck as dawn now admitted it was there and shone its light into the east. Her thoughts reverted back to what she would do, what they would do, when she reached the cottage. Cleus had told her that both Remus and Septimus were now living with him. Cecilia bristled at the thought of his intrusion. It had been his decision to send her away, admittedly as a result of her behavior, but his action nonetheless. He had kept her from her son for almost 2 years, something she knew for which she could never forgive him, for she could never replace the time she had lost with Septimus. But Cecilia also knew trying to live holding on to the bitterness would be of little use at all. She had to think practically, pragmatically and sensibly. Only then would she win through. Cecilia smiled to herself as she reminded herself what her first sensible action would be. An hour later, her exit far less graceful than her embarkation, Cecilia scrambled down the side of the ship and getting wet. The ship had not berthed in a dock or quay but at the foot of the Scarborough Cliffs, just down the coast from the jet that she remembered finding when she was a teenager on a geography field trip, and she half expected to see marching up and down the shore flinging his arms dramatically at the cliffs. So that was what the ship had done. She had been told by one of the women researchers that the ship knew where you wanted to be, and Cecilia was certainly in England, admittedly on the wrong coast. But that was easily resolved. With the past dripping from her like the briny sea through which she had just swum to reach land, Cecilia thought of the bright future that awaited her family. Callias wouldn't like it, but she really didn't care anymore. It had been a long time since they were all together in Edgeford, but it was something which was long overdue.